Welcome to this module about identity, openness, and cultural considerations in permanency and adoption, developed by the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work, in partnership with the University of Vermont Department of Social Work. By the end of this module, participants will be able to 1. Identify how permanency and adoption impact children at all stages of development, from birth to adulthood. 2. Understand the basic tenets of the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act and the Indian Child Welfare Act. 3. Understand how race and culture interact with identity development for children in permanency and adoption. 4. Understand the concerns that transracially adopted or placed children might face. 5. Identify the different types of openness in adoption. 6. Identify some of the benefits and some of the challenges of openness in adoptions. Adoption presents challenges for normative development for children and adolescents, and in particular, identity development. Most of us are familiar with Erikson's theory of human development over the lifespan. According to Erikson, human beings work to attain or resolve certain psychosocial tasks during different age periods from infancy to death. Psychologist David Brodzinski and his colleagues posited additional dimensions to these tasks that adopted persons will face. In addition, child development expert Vera Fahlberg advocates professionals understand the impact of multiple transitions, which so often are a part of permanency and adoption on a child's development. Understanding these additional tasks is important for adoptive parents and professionals working with adopted children, youth, and adults, particularly so that they can understand behavior in context to adoption as a lifelong process. The different stages of development, according to Erikson, are infancy, toddler, preschool, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. It is helpful to consider each of these stages from infancy to young adulthood and their additional adoption-related tasks in more depth. Erikson's theory of human development theorized the psychological tasks that humans must resolve or reconcile are universal to all humans. Each of these psychological tasks were most present and central to a specific age period, but that a person could be revisiting and continuing to work on resolving tasks even in later age periods. Each of these tasks are presented as opposing ends of a spectrum. However, Erikson did not mean that one is all positive and one is all negative, but rather a balancing act for each of these two opposing states. Birth through 18 months old is considered the infancy period. An infant is vulnerable and in need of physical and emotional comfort and care. From birth to 18 months, according to Erikson, the most important psychological task that an infant must reconcile or resolve is related to trust. The baby must learn whether they can trust the world. Erikson phrased it as trust versus mistrust. The infant must learn to trust that adults will respond to his or her needs. By trusting that adult caregivers will provide the physical and emotional nurturance the baby needs, the infant begins to see the world as a safe place. The balancing act of achieving trust must also include a healthy instinct of mistrust. An infant must be able to understand that not everyone that is caring for them can or should be trusted, thus balancing the opposing states. Many people incorrectly think that babies and infants are too young to know what is happening to them when placed for adoption or in foster care. However, emerging research shows that the experiences of infants and children form implicit, sensory, and pre-verbal memories that can later show up as triggers for behaviors. These include prenatal experiences. The infant has also experienced loss, and this loss can make the child attuned or sensitive to additional losses as she or he grows. In addition, the more transitions an infant experiences, the more this may interfere with the ability to begin or complete the work of trusting the world. The permanency-related tasks that an infant has to work through related to trust and mistrust include adjusting to a new placement and the transition to a new caregiver. Will this new caregiver, the foster or adoptive parents, be safe, and will they attend to my needs? Will I be able to attach to this new caregiver? Will this caregiver stay, or will I be moved again and have to try to trust yet another caregiver to meet my needs? Behaviors to transitioning to a new home and caregiver that might be related to trust and mistrust might include eating issues, such as refusing to eat, overeating, or spitting up after eating. Sleep issues. Chronic and extended periods of intense crying, temper tantrums, or rages. Hypervigilance, when the baby is quiet but has a wide-eyed look as the baby tracks the movement of others. Withdrawal, when the baby won't engage in eye contact or communicate with caregivers. Often, hypervigilance and withdrawal are mistaken for compliance or good behavior. Caregivers or parents may praise how quiet and calm an infant is in comparison to a child that has very externalized behaviors. However, these infants are in fact very distressed. Trust is core to a person's ability to form relationships, attach and bond to parents and caregivers, and feel safe. Professionals and parents must work to provide a sense of security and trust with infants that have experienced loss and adoption. Thalberg states that trust and security develop as a result of day-to-day experiences, and that it is the quality of the daily interactions between parent and child that helps children develop physically and mentally. The next developmental period, according to Erikson, is the time period from 1.5 to 3 years of age. The core psychological quest for the toddler years is one of autonomy or shame. According to Erikson, the question is it okay to be me? Toddlers are known for their constant need for independence. They are constantly saying no or I do it. Many temper tantrums happen after parents and caregivers try to speed up a task that a toddler has started, such as putting on their own shoes. Toddlers also begin to understand the power of communication. They may be frustrated when they are unable to communicate their needs in a way that adults can understand. The toddler is in search of autonomy and control, and for adults to validate their ability to accomplish tasks. Major tasks in the toddler years revolve around toilet training and controlling gross motor skills. When the child is not allowed to try to be independent or autonomous, they feel a sense of shame. Permanency-related tasks for toddlers may vary depending on whether the child is adopted during the toddler years or adopted at a younger age. Additional adoption-related tasks for toddlers include gaining a sense of control over daily routines and desires, managing difficulty with transitions, particularly if the child has experienced many placements, understanding object permanence when having lost people and objects through their transitions, managing separation anxiety, normal for this age, but symptoms may be more pronounced for a child that has had multiple homes and caregivers. According to Thalberg, although the child's behaviors may be frustrating to adults, if the youngster does not gain this sense of self as worthwhile and capable, there will be serious long-term consequences. 3 through 5 years of age are considered the preschool years, according to Erikson. The preschool years are an age of great growth as children begin to expand their sense of independence and autonomy around the struggle between initiative versus guilt. Initiative is about exploring the world and learning what can and cannot be accomplished independently. Erikson says the core question during this age period is one of, can I do these things? Guilt comes into play if the child feels their actions do not get the results they want. Additional permanency-related tasks for preschool-age children with a lot of transitions, multiple homes and caregivers, and trauma experiences include trying to understand what adoption means and understand their history of out-of-home placement, recognizing differences of physical appearance. Children in this stage are curious about how they look similar and different from others in their family. Learning about birth and reproduction and understanding the people they live with did not give birth to them. Trying to understand concretely how a person could be related to someone without being biologically connected. Parents often begin to tell adopted children that they were adopted during this age period. Children typically do not fully understand what adoption means. Dr. Brodzinski states that children this age tend to parrot their story about adoption without fully understanding what it means. Children in this stage might think everyone is adopted. If there are physical racial differences, adopted children might express sadness over not sharing the same skin, hair, or eye color as their adoptive parents. Adoption professionals often use language such as forever family, which can be confusing for a child who has had at minimum 2 families, birth and adoptive, and maybe several more if in foster care. The use of the term adoption in bringing pets into a family, or adopting highways or other charity activities, can be confusing for a child during this age period. Children may blame themselves for the loss of their first family. They may believe it was their fault that they were not wanted. Children may feel rejected or feel they were unlovable. Children this age are starting to understand good and bad and assign people to these categories. They may have difficulty understanding figurative and literal comments about adoption and birth parents. Children in middle childhood, ages 6 through 12, seek to gain confidence through their competence. The earlier skills of trust, autonomy, and initiative are the building blocks to competency. Erikson calls this industry versus inferiority. The question children are attempting to answer is, can I make it? During this stage, children who do not feel competent may develop a sense that they are not capable of meeting the expectations placed on them. Children also begin developing skills, talents, and interests of their own, independent from their parents or friends. They are curious and enjoy initiating activities. They are very concerned with fairness. The feelings of fear that they had when younger start to become anxiety and worry as they reach the later stages of middle childhood. Permanency-related tasks for adopted children may include understanding the context for their adoption as they gain a greater knowledge of how families are formed, trying to understand the reasons for their relinquishment and placement, being different, and the stigma that adoption carries in society, figuring out how to talk about their adoption with peers who may be curious, particularly if the child is different racially or in physical appearance. Children on the younger side of middle childhood often feel a great deal of comfort in their adoption, according to Dr. Brodzinski. However, as they near their tween years, they may feel less comforted and more sensitive. Many children's movies for this age group have child abandonment, evil stepmothers, and adoption as a theme. These can be very triggering and confusing for children if they are unprepared for this content. Many of these films perpetuate negative stereotypes about adoption, adoptive parents, and birth parents. Parents should be aware of these stereotypes and be prepared to address them with their children. Adolescence, ages 13 to 19 years, is the time when the quest for identity, including self-concept, interests, future careers, begins in earnest. The main question, according to Erikson, is who am I? The challenge for adolescence is to avoid role confusion. Adolescence can be an incredibly challenging time for adoptive parents and professionals working with persons who are adopted. Dr. Fahlberg writes that the task for the adolescent is similar to that of a toddler, to see him or herself as an individual outside his or her family. Psychologist James Marcia would call this a time of moving from identity foreclosure, accepting identity based on parents and family, to one of seeking out and experimenting with new identities in order to solidify identity, known as identity achievement. While it is natural for teenagers to begin to think about how they are different and similar to their parents, it is more complex for adopted youth to compare themselves to their biological families. They may have a desire to seek information or relationships with birth parents or birth family if they do not already have contact. They may seek this information on their own without telling their adoptive parents. Adopted adolescents often have feelings of split loyalty, wanting to be part of both biological and adoptive families, and fearing that they will be rejected by their adoptive parents if they express an interest in having knowledge of or contact with their birth family. Additional adoption-related tasks for adolescents might include navigating romantic and sexual relationships, fear of becoming like a birth parent, particularly if the youth was removed because of abuse or neglect or due to an unplanned teenage pregnancy, working through fantasies about their birth family, coping with differences, particularly if there are racial dissimilarities, coping with fears about transitioning to adulthood if there were many placements prior to the adoption, considering a search for information or contact with their biological family, figuring out belonging and split loyalty between birth and adoptive families. Although adolescence technically ends at age 19, emerging research concludes that the brain does not fully develop until around 25 years old. The term emerging adulthood has been coined to describe the phase between late adolescence and adulthood. The young adulthood period is throughout an individual's 20s and 30s. The theme of young adulthood is one of intimacy or isolation. During this period, humans begin to think about relationships with potential spouses or partners, as well as the potential for raising a family. The question, according to Erikson, is, can I love? Typical tasks for young adults with adoption and foster care histories might include exploring implications of past history on attachment, love, and romantic relationships, birth family search, questions or concerns about repeating history, thinking about or adjusting to parenthood and related attachment, facing unknown genetic history for both self and potential children, coping with and grieving losses. Adopted or formerly fostered individuals may still be struggling with their identity. Transracially adopted young adults often have their first real experiences with their communities of color without their adoptive parents, and this can be a time of real struggle as they figure out which communities they feel a part of. Without going into depth on the latter phases of Erikson's developmental theory, the following should be considered regarding the final stages of the lifespan through middle and older adulthood. Children with adoption and foster care histories often become parents at some point. Professionals working in permanency and adoption can understand the family dynamics more thoroughly if they ask about and factor in parents' permanency and adoption histories. If lingering attachment issues around foster adoption history haven't been addressed, or if individuals have not learned skills to cope with loss or appropriately grieved, the cycle of relinquishment, abandonment, attachment may show up again in parenting styles. Adults with adoption or placement histories may be continuing to resolve issues around trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, and intimacy, even if they are not parents. Now we will turn our attention to race, ethnicity, and cultural considerations in permanency and adoption. Race, culture, and ethnicity are important considerations in permanency and adoption. It is unlikely that professionals working in the field will not come up against conflict related to race, culture, or ethnicity. Although it is known that race is a social construct and does not actually exist as a biological fact, society still differentiates and discriminates based on physical appearance and ethnic or cultural heritage. Historically, race, culture, and ethnicity have influenced the placement of children in foster care or adoption in many ways. The orphan train movement targeted children from immigrant ethnic minority populations. Many of the children placed from the orphan trains were from immigrant families and were Catholic or Jewish and placed into Protestant families in farming communities. The Native American boarding schools and the Child Welfare League of America's Indian Adoption Project both aimed to assimilate Native American children into dominant European American culture. African American children were typically not included in child welfare services until the 1950s. Inter-country adoptions began in the post-World War II period, and the majority of the children adopted are placed transracially and transculturally with white adoptive parents. These historical influences have impacted modern policy and practice. Before delving further into race, ethnicity, and cultural considerations in permanency and adoption, take a moment and consider, what have been your professional or personal experiences with transracial adoption? What do you see as challenges and benefits? Transracial adoption has been and continues to be a controversial practice. The Native American and African American communities in particular have raised concerns about transracial and transcultural placements of Native American and African American children into white adoptive families. In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers, NABSW, came out with a position statement criticizing transracial adoption. Among the NABSW's concern was that white adoptive parents were unequipped to affirm an African American child's racial and cultural identity. As a result, transracial adoptive placements declined as adoption practitioners focused on matching children by race in adoption. However, some expressed concern that African American children in foster care were being delayed or denied adoptive homes because of race matching. In 1994, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, also known as MIPA, was passed. The goal of MIPA was to facilitate permanency for African American children who are overrepresented in foster care. MIPA prohibited the delay or denial of a child into a prospective foster or adoptive home based on the child's or the prospective parent's race, color, or national origin. MIPA also required that child welfare agencies implement recruitment plans that result in a pool of prospective parents that resemble the children in need of placement. The Inter-Ethnic Provisions, IEP, passed in 1996, further clarified MIPA. MIPA and IEP only apply to children in public foster care. MIPA and IEP do not apply to the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. Critics of MIPA feel that the legislation does not address why there is an overrepresentation of African American children in foster care. Others say that the majority of the prospective adoptive parents who adopt from foster care are white and are not open to adopting transracially. Therefore, the legislation has not accomplished its goal. While recruitment is a requirement of MIPA, agencies struggle to meet the goal of having a pool of prospective parents that resemble the children in need of placement. The Indian Child Welfare Act, also known as ICWA, was passed in 1978. Professionals are sometimes confused by the purpose and aim of ICWA. ICWA is often presented as a race-based law, but that is not the sole purpose of the act. Because tribes are semi-sovereign nations, the purpose of ICWA is to protect jurisdictional rights for children who are enrolled or eligible for enrollment in the tribe. Because the Native American boarding schools and Indian Adoption Project had specific goals around assimilating children to lessen their cultural identity, tribes reserve the right to have a say in making sure that wherever the child is placed, it will be with parents or caregivers that can positively affirm the child's tribal identity. Tribes view a child as a member of a community, not just an individual family system. The loss of a child to a non-Indian family is a loss to the whole tribal community. One of the core tenets of ICWA is the hierarchy of placement preferences. The first preference is with an extended family member. ICWA has a broader definition of family member or relative than other laws. If a child cannot be placed safely within the extended family, the next preference is with another family in the child's tribal community. If there is not an appropriate placement within the tribal community, the tribe will seek placement with a Native American family outside of the tribe. Finally, if all other options have been exhausted, the tribe may approve the placement of a child within a non-Native American family. It is a misconception that tribes will only place Native American children within Native American homes. Tribes do place children in non-Native American homes. They just want the ability to be involved in those placement decisions to make sure the foster or adoptive family will positively affirm the child's cultural heritage. Given the history of American child welfare policies aimed to eliminate Native American culture, it is important to the Native American community to have legal rights to determine the best interests of their children. Research has shown that for the most part, children adopted transracially do very well in their adoptive families. Research has also found that while children do well overall, transracially adopted children have unique and additional needs related to developing a positive racial identity. The diagram below shows that children adopted transracially or internationally have additional tasks related to development that they must reconcile that children adopted in same-race placements do not. The majority of research studies examining transracial identity are done on children and adolescent adoptees. We know that identity development really does not begin until the teenage and young adult years, so the research has a gap in helping us understand what would improve the racial identity process for transracially adopted persons. In a 2009 study conducted by the Donaldson Adoption Institute, Korean Americans adopted transracially as children reported that 86% grew up in areas that had less than a 10% Asian population, and 78% said they received teasing due to race and ethnicity. Korean adoptees reported experiences with discrimination. 80% reported experiences with discrimination at the hands of strangers. 75% of respondents experienced discrimination from classmates, and 38% reported discrimination from friends. This study also revealed that respondents received more discrimination due to their race than due to their adoption status. Another finding of this study was that racial and ethnic identity played a more important role as the Korean adoptee aged. 67% said their racial ethnic identity was important to them in high school. 75% said it was important to them in college, and 81% said it was important to them in young adulthood. Samuel found in her 2009 study of transracially adopted biracial, African American and white, young adults that they felt racially alienated, lacked a community in which they felt they fit in racially, and sometimes felt disconnected with their white adoptive families because of the racial differences. Some of the concerns that transracially adopted children might struggle with include a desire to look like their adoptive parents. Many children in the toddler to early childhood age groups express the desire to have the same color skin as their parents, or say they wish they were white. Feeling different from their peers if they are in schools with little to no racial and cultural diversity. Feeling unable to share with parents if they are being bullied or discriminated against due to their race and culture. This often happens when adoptive parents try to emphasize by minimizing or generalizing teasing and bullying, such as saying, everyone gets teased for something, or just have a thick skin. Having to justify or defend why they look different from their adoptive family, and feeling hyper-visible. Same-race adopted children who blend in do not have to answer questions from the public about their real family. Feeling as if their racial or ethnic community is negative, and struggling with the stereotypes about people from their racial or ethnic community. Transracially adopted teenagers and adults often say they feel unwelcomed or awkward in their interactions with their racial or ethnic community because they do not understand shared cultural contexts. Susan Harris O'Connor developed a racial identity development model that includes 5 dimensions of racial identity for transracial adopted persons. 1. Genetic racial identity, which includes the biological aspects of one's genetic background that are perceived as racial. 2. Imposed racial identity, the aspects of one's identity that are imposed on them by others. 3. Cognitive racial identity, the racial identity that a person believes himself to be. 4. Visual racial identity, the outward physical appearance of skin, hair texture, and other features. And 5. Feeling racial identity, the racial identity a person feels inside, which can often be different from their genetic, imposed, cognitive, or visual identities. Over the past 2 decades, white adoptive parents that adopt transracially have begun to participate in cultural awareness activities for their children, such as attending activities within their child's cultural communities, eating ethnic food, and attending culture camps. However, a study by Dr. Lee in 2003 found that parents are more likely to participate in ethnic celebration activities and less likely to engage in activities that prepare their transracially adopted children for how to handle racial discrimination. It is important to consider children adopted at an older age often have a more developed sense of racial identity than children adopted as infants or young children, particularly if they have been raised in their racial or ethnic community. Research has found that high levels of ethnic identification have been shown to be a positive influence for people of color, particularly in promoting self-esteem. Adoptive parents that adopt transracially may not be aware of the challenges that their children will face in terms of feelings of difference, identity development, and racism and discrimination. They may feel that love is enough. Professionals need to provide transracial adoptive parents with resources and support so they can support and advocate on behalf of their children. We will now turn our attention toward openness in adoption. Prior to the 1917 Minnesota adoption law, adoptions were not confidential, and adoption and birth records were not sealed. The Minnesota law started the practice of closed and confidential adoptions that by the end of World War II had become standard practice. Today, most states still have laws prohibiting adopted persons from accessing their original birth certificate and their adoption records. However, over the past few decades, there has been a general recognition that open adoptions are better for all members of the adoption kinship network. And now, most private adoptions have some degree of openness and contact between birth and adoptive families. There are different types of openness in adoption, ranging from open to closed, including open adoptions in which the child has an in-person relationship with birth relatives. Birth relatives could include, but are not limited to, mother, father, siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and cousins. Open adoptions in which the child does not meet with birth relatives in person, but may share phone calls, email messages, cards, or letters. Disclosed adoptions in which the adoptive parents exchange phone calls, emails, or letters directly with the birth family, but the child is not included in these exchanges. Disclosed adoptions in which identifying information, photographs, or letters have been passed on through an intermediary, such as an adoption agency, attorney, or facilitator, but the birth and adoptive families do not have direct access to each other. Closed adoptions, in which the adoptive and birth families have no information about the other family. Research by Dr. Hal Grodevant and others has found that openness is beneficial for the adopted child. Openness benefits the child and the adoptive family by reducing unrealistic fantasies about the birth family by the child, helping to provide a roadmap in terms of genetic and medical family history, providing answers to questions about other family history and issues, reducing the child's split loyalty between birth and adoptive families, providing the child with a mirror in terms of identity, reducing feelings of difference, helping the child know the circumstances around her relinquishment and adoption, reducing ambiguous loss. Open adoptions can also help birth parents and birth family by reducing ambiguous loss and providing information and knowledge about the child's well-being. It can also aid the birth family's grieving process. Openness in adoption is not without challenges. Adoptive and birth parents may struggle with setting appropriate boundaries. Although a contact agreement or level of openness between birth and adoptive families may have been created and signed at the finalization, sometimes the adoptive or birth family breaks the contact agreement. More often, it is the adoptive parents that cut off contact, but sometimes it is the birth family, or even the child, who requests for contact to end. Mediated adoptions may become closed due to staffing issues at an agency or lack of response by the adoption attorney or facilitator. Issues related to jealousy, hurt feelings, or grief might get in the way of the relationship, particularly around siblings or new romantic relationships in the birth family. Safety issues may become a concern. Adoptive or birth parents may have differing views on how to parent. Dr. David Brodzinski states that communicative openness is more important than structural openness, and that adoptive and birth parents should keep communication open about levels and types of contact, boundaries, expectations, and understand that these will change over time. Many adopted persons have a desire to meet or find information about their birth parents, and vice versa. The adopted person or the birth parent often initiates a search. However, there are more adoptive parents who are initiating a search for birth family on behalf of, or even without the knowledge of, the adopted child. A search may be conducted in order to find medical and social history, or it may be to find a person. Not all who search seek a personal relationship. One of the benefits and challenges of the technological age is the ability for birth and adoptive families to find each other using social media. Facebook, in particular, is increasingly used by adopted youth, birth parents, and adoptive parents to seek out other members of the adoption kinship network. Navigating a relationship after finding family members can be difficult. Sometimes parties feel harassed or imposed upon via social media contact. Dr. Deborah Siegel has conducted several research studies on open adoptions, and in a report written for the Donaldson Adoption Institute, Siegel and her colleague Susan Smith identified the following as facilitating successful open adoptions. Adoptive and birth parents have a shared understanding about the purpose of openness in their adoption relationship, knowing that it is child-focused and not meant to erase the losses inherent in adoption. Both families are committed to having a respectful, honest, trustworthy relationship. Both families are committed to expressing their needs and exercising self-determination in the creation of the open adoption relationship. Both parties collaborate, communicate, and plan for flexibility and room for change. Siegel and Smith recommend professionals institute the following practices in their work with permanency and adoptive families regarding openness. Both birth and adoptive parents should receive counseling and education about open adoption options and their strengths and challenges in a non-directive way. If an open adoption plan is agreed upon by birth and adoptive parents, both parents should receive training, education, or counseling on what facilitates successful open adoption relationships. Available and accessible post-adoption services should be offered in case the families need assistance in the future related to their open adoption relationship. In this module, the impact of adoption and permanency on development, specifically of identity, was discussed. We discussed issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture. We learned about controversies in the placement of children from racial and ethnic communities with white adoptive parents, and how some communities have responded to the practice of transracial placements. In addition, we discussed how issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture impact the identity development of adopted persons. Finally, we looked at issues related to openness and learned about some of the benefits and challenges when there is openness between birth and adoptive families. More information on many of the topics covered today can be referenced in the resource list. Thank you for participating in this module on adoption and permanency.